Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Worcester Vineyard. This is the talk for Sunday, the 22nd, I believe, of August. And again, it's just a short thought for the day. And one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently is weakness and vulnerability. And God's been speaking to me a bit about that. It's something that actually we were all kind of reminded of during COVID, because suddenly we became very vulnerable. Things were out of control for us, which we don't tend to like as human beings naturally. We like to be in control. We like to think that we're invulnerable, that we can cope with anything. And then the pandemic reminded us that we are actually very fragile, and we are vulnerable and in many ways weak. And as churches, we don't really often like to talk about that, and yet God says some very interesting things in the scripture about weakness and vulnerability. And mostly we try to do everything to avoid being weak and vulnerable. We try and organise life and do all that we can to make sure that we can cope. That's what people panic buy, because they don't want to be vulnerable about not having food in their larder. But that's part of the difficulties of the human condition. We don't like to admit that we're vulnerable and fragile, and yet we are. That's the truth. That's the reality of it. And as I said, it's not something that the church tends to focus on. We like to talk about the things that are working well. We like to talk about things that are big and resource driven, and often it's sometimes in a human way, but God always seems to work through fragility and vulnerability. And I was reminded of the passage that Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, which you'll probably know very well. He's just been describing the fact that he's had this thorn in the flesh, which nobody quite knows what it was, whether it's something physical or spiritual or some kind of opposition, or we don't really know. But he goes on to say this: 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, because my power is made perfect in weakness. Very interesting. Therefore, he says, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So Paul says there's something paradoxical about the fact that God's power comes when we're vulnerable, when we're weak. God moves. God's grace is there. And often we need to almost embrace our vulnerabilities and weakness. And I mean, how often would we say that we delight in weakness? We delight in hardships, persecutions, difficulties. We're always trying to minimize them, get rid of them. And we don't like to place ourselves in vulnerable positions. But yet often it's only as we do that, as we step out and do something for the first time, when we know we can't cope with it, or when we're led into some kind of new ministry, some new thing we've never done before. It's a place of vulnerability, because you don't know quite where you're going. You might be thought foolish if you try doing something for the first time, or stepping outside your comfort zone. But always God is asking us to do that. That's what part of the journey of the Christian faith is about. It's about stepping out of your comfort zones and trusting him as his Spirit leads us. And often, as he does lead us into difficulties and hardships and trials and tests, because he wants us to rely on him and allow his power to work through us. And when we're self-sufficient, when we think we can cope, we don't pray, we don't trust him, nothing happens, because it's just us. But when we embrace vulnerability, then God's redemptive work, his power, is at work, often in surprising ways. And just thinking of Jesus himself. He was the ultimate one who embraced vulnerability and weakness and fragility, and coming as a human being, as a little child, and then growing up and going through life and doing all that the Father asked him to do. He was completely vulnerable, and he never shied away from that vulnerability. He never shied away from subjecting himself to the hatred of mankind and all to redeem us and save us. And that the cross is the ultimate demonstration of weakness and vulnerability, and yet it's the most powerful moment in human history, as he takes upon himself all of the mess, the sin of the world, and he comes to life and redeems it all. So just think about that this week. In those times when you're tempted to shy away from vulnerability and do everything you can to avoid it, sometimes you've got to embrace it, and then God's power comes. May God bless you as you think about that and work through that this week, and may his love and his power and his grace rest on you. Bless you.